time to begin. I would like to welcome Milica Popovic to our Brownback seminar this week. Milica is currently a fellow at the Yehuda Elkana Center for Higher Education at CEU in Vienna. But today she's going to be presenting her research, which she's conducting in the framework of her PhD studies at Sciences Po in Paris, which is looking at issues of post-Yugoslav memories as resistance strategies, the political in Yugonostalgia. So looking forward to your presentation, Milica. The floor is yours. And then again, for everybody as a reminder, please keep your cameras and microphones turned off. After the presentation, you can ask questions either in person by raising your hand or otherwise through the chat option, which is also possible. So that's it. And Milica, please.
Thank you, Florian, and thanks for the invitation. So I will be presenting my completed PhD research, and I'm currently just waiting for the defense date. It is, of course, always a bit problematic to, in a short period of time, say everything that you have done, but I will be just trying to really pick out the most interesting points. Let's start with the idea why Yugonostalgia. Why was this a topic that I thought was still relevant to research? Because when we think about it, especially looking through the media, this is a topic that has been approached mostly from the cultural studies point of view. It has been a little bit everywhere. We can think that, okay, this is boring and there is nothing new that we can actually say about it. And it might be completely irrelevant also, especially for the political space, since my aim was kind of to bring together memory studies and political sociology in this research. And we know that the topic of nostalgia in the political field really started appearing within the post-socialist area. But then also in the last couple of years, it started gaining some space, especially within the media reports when we were discussing Brexit or Trump. So it started being more prominent about thinking whether nostalgia is really relevant for the political space or not. And talking specifically about Yugonostalgia, in the scholarship so far, there have been two approaches, one which has been saying, okay, yeah, this is a phenomenon that happens, but it doesn't really bring anything new onto the table. And then there was another stream of scholars who would say, no, there is actually a serious, strong subversive potentiality in nostalgia. So I wanted to see, like, does it really, and where does it lead? So I was trying to bring three key concepts of memory, generation, nostalgia within the political field. And then I thought, okay, so my question that I want to do is on one side to really focus on a specific generation, the generation of the last pioneers, meaning people born between 1974 and 1982, who are politically active, so who are political actors today, in double senses, whether they're members of parliament or they're active within the political parties, but not necessarily taking up the institutional roles of members of parliament, or being active in different social movements, different new emerging political spaces within the region, which you must know also very, very well. And I wanted to know, what does this term of Yugonostalgia actually mean for this generation? And how does it dialogue with their political identities? Is there an ongoing negotiation between their own personal memory narratives and the way they have conceived themselves as political actors today? So between 2017, 2019, I lived pretty much like the photo shows. But I focused on three countries: Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. So I did all in total 62 interviews, 18 Slovenia, 23 Croatia, 21 Serbia, which came down to about 2,000 pages of transcripts to actually be coded. And I took in general a methodological approach of constructivist grounded theory, meaning I had a research situation, I had a research question, but I had no hypothesis previously. What is also important to say that we have to understand that when I'm discussing and presenting my research, I'm not aiming to make any generalizations. Of course, what the research shows are these glimpses of memory narratives that have been as such in the time of research, and within this specific sample that I have actually researched, I have taken up the purposive snowballing sampling methodology. And as we can see, actually a lot of the sample reflects some of the realities, because for me, what was important is that they're political actors, politically active in the sense that I have defined, that they live in one of the three countries that I was researching, and that they belong to the generation of the last pioneers. But then we could have seen, for example, the gender disparity, which shows the general gender disparity in political activism in those three countries. We could have seen a reflection, for example, that 90% of the sample were people having tertiary education completed, which opens the question of the participation of less educated populations in the political space within the three countries. I was trying to make sure that I was not only doing the interviews within the capital cities, but also having more of regional diversity within the three countries. And then, of course, I wanted to have the whole of political spectrum. But having this noble purposive sampling approach did end up if having 58% of people self-identifying as left-wing. What is also important to notice here is that I didn't want to impose the political identification upon my interviewees, but at the beginning of the interview, I have let them actually declare and self-identify themselves, which wouldn't necessarily always agree with what I would perceive where on the political spectrums they are, or where the general political science would even, in a sense, put them. What was interesting maybe to say is that also there was a number of them who were reluctant to self-identify, claiming that these kind of understandings are largely overcome. So what I ended up were these long memory narratives where we discussed how do they remember, because this is a generation that was born in socialist Yugoslavia, that was going through the adolescent times during the dissolution and the wars, and who has actually become this part of the most active population in the present and in the aftermath of the wars in the post-Yugoslav times, so to say, and who are now today recreating and participating in the political field of today. So we were thinking how and why do they see themselves as children of socialism, how their political socialization in the Yugoslav times, what kind of terms, what kind of really main codes were they bringing, and how did that amount to specific concepts of how they remember their own growing up, their own political socialization, and what do they tell us? Because actually, every time we tell a narrative, we're saying something about our identity. We're saying something about our story. And that's why telling a specific narrative for the political actors also tells us on how they conceive their own political identity. So going briefly to kind of look, how do they remember their childhoods and what does it mean for their political identity today? And there were a number of specific concepts that emerged. There was this idea of a Yugoslav family, which was very specific in their perception for Yugoslavia. And that was not only a family that was mixed in ethno-national sense, but one that was mixed in terms of political identities, religious identities. A lot of them would tell us stories about a Marxist father and a Catholic mother, and how this was all kind of really coming together. Interesting points maybe to note was that the right-wing interviewees would always explain that actually their political identity today really is very much strongly connected to their paternal heritage. What was also maybe interesting to say, especially if we take into account the crisis of socialist Yugoslavia, the economic crisis of socialist Yugoslavia in the late 80s, in which the last pioneers were growing up, there was, however, more prone anti-Yugoslavism within the families were actually, in economic sense, better off, so to say. Almost anonymously, all of the interviewees would claim that they had absolutely no awareness of their ethno-national identity. Then, of course, this is important to be understood that it could have had different manifestations, whether it was really the lack of idea if they were Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, or whatever, whether it was having some vague specific knowledge about it, but not really deeming it irrelevant for their own growing up. And why the pioneers? Because the memory on becoming a pioneer was one of the most positive memories that all of the interviewees have shown. And when reflecting, what does it really mean to have these feelings of carelessness and safety when they reminisce their childhoods, was actually on one side to understand this pioneers, so to say, values that they have been accepting in their early political socialization in the Yugoslav times, and through the concept of a normal life. And why this normal life was really interesting. It is something that sociologists, for example, Ivana Spasic, was early on noticing also in her research on Yugonostalgia. But for Ivana Spasic, it was claimed that this idea of normality is not a political one. But actually, when we try to kind of unpack what, for our interviewees, this concept of normal life truly means, it does come down to strong social and political values, like solidarity, like the idea of freedom, like equality, social justice, welfare state, anti-nationalism, women's emancipation. So a number of political values would actually emerge through these narratives, and the way that the last pioneers are trying to make meaning of their experiences. With their adolescence, their political socialization finds itself in a completely different environment, of course. There is a sense of rupture, there is a sense of loss, and there is the code of overnight. Overnight was the word that was used in almost all of the interviews. And that meant that everything changed overnight. From this kind of understood almost idyllic childhoods where they had everything, where, yeah, maybe things were not perfect, but actually they were perfectly happy, their families were happy, things were really going well. Overnight, there is a nightmare that appears. They are growing up and they are struggling to understand, on one side, the new imposed identities with which they have woken up, and on the other side, this new normality of violence, everybody leaving, all of a sudden, all of their social tissues kind of being completely torn apart, whether it is families, whether it was friendships. And we come to the concept of 1990s, where, for example, for the first time, we start seeing differentiation between the interviewees in Slovenia and Croatia and in Serbia, because, for example, the 1990s for interviewees in Slovenia does not really have such a significant element. It refers maybe to the wars in the rest of the Yugoslav states, while in Croatia and in Serbia, it becomes a very saturated, a very important concept. And within this arrival to these rupture narratives, to this moment where everything changed, the interviewees would start their own reflexive processes within the interviews. So that would be the first moment where they start, through attempting to explain actually what was happening to them and what was happening to the society, they start the process of negotiation between their political positionality and the memory narratives that they have. And they find two strategies to resolve these cognitive dissonances which appear. One is either realizing that actually anything that has been said positive is today really being used and named as Yugonostalgic, but as a sort of a discursive strategy of the political elites who have participated in the dissolution of the country, or if they come from a more center or right-wing part of the political spectrum, they start realizing that their happy narratives have to be somehow re-narrated. And they start using more and more techniques of singularity and exceptionality, saying, yeah, well, you know, I don't remember that there was any kind of repression. I went to religious education, but that must have been an exception. And I'm pretty sure there were horrible things happening elsewhere. So this is where we first see how much on one side, the generational positionality starts having a different so to say, life, and in parallel with the political positionality when we negotiate and when we dialogue with our memory narratives. And when they look today, they say, okay, so what is the post-Yugoslav space today? And there are a number of tropes which once again appear. And the first association where we see this importance of generational positionality, the importance that they did grow up during the, even if so young during the socialist Yugoslav times, is the sentiment of a home. The first association, besides the Adriatic Sea, which of course remains as the most important location within the Yugoslav space, but it's really this understanding that this is still a place where they are at home and they're not strangers. And then once again, we can of course see further social distancing appearing, having done the interviews in Serbia, in Croatia, and in Slovenia, discussing the proximities, where of course the linguistic proximity does play a very important role. Among all of the interviewees, regardless of their political positionality or in which country they live in today, had almost neither recollections, neither sentiments of proximity with Kosovo. Kosovo is almost forgotten in their narratives, whether related to the past or today. Sometimes on the right wing, in Serbia, it appears as a political problem to be solved, but it is not really in any way prominent when they're actually telling us their life story. There is no discussion. Of course, this is a common economic space. It's a common cultural space. Some of the left-wing interviewees pose a question whether this still existing so-called Yugosphere actually is just for the elites, whether this is something that is shared across different class structures of the post-Yugoslav space. And they kind of start still recognizing so-called shared mentality. And we can see that they always have a perception that it is better. And even in Slovenia, they would say, yeah, but things are much better in Croatia and in Serbia and all the other way around. Because for all of the interviewees, actually, the present is negative. It is considered as something which is really, really bad, so to say, which is not functioning, where they have lost as new states either sense of sovereignty, which is especially important for the right-wing interviewees, either any kind of economic and social security. And then, of course, some of these problems are sometimes also explained through this idea of a shared, once again, mentality, the socialist mentality. So what is Yugonostalgia, so to say, and discussing? And I also try to talk to them and to see how do they perceive it. And personally, I have decided to accept the term of Yugonostalgia in my research in order to really unpack at least additional meanings for them. And this is something that is primarily a strategy of actually naming any kind of positive reflections, emotions, and potentialities of the socialist Yugoslav space, and not only positive, even sometimes the ambivalent or any kind of not directly negative reflections very easily become named as Yugonostalgic. Let's not forget that actually so far that the research has managed to show, the term Yugonostalgia appeared for the first time in 1992 in the famous text of Slaven Letica in Croatian Globus, which was persecuting and harassing the famous 5 activists in Croatia, for which the reasons a number of them had to leave. So even the interviewees start saying, well, yeah, actually, you know, Yugonostalgia, that is not really something that exists. That is when we try to express our political attitudes concerning specific issues, that we start being called Yugonostalgic, but it's not necessarily a phenomenon per se. And when I started to kind of uncover, so what is within these narratives? So on one side, what is this interplay of the generational and the political positionality of the last pioneers with their own memory narratives? How do we see on one side the continuity that they need to build, because every identity needs a sort of a continuous narrative, a coherent narrative, and in the same time, this circularity, which makes them continuously narrate and re-narrate their own life stories, in the same time within an understanding and approach of multidirectional memory, that memory is also being influenced from so many different perspectives, that is always capable of negotiating and dialoguing with a number of larger socioeconomic political frameworks. And all of a sudden, we actually see two phenomena in this kind of fuzzy idea of Yugonostalgia. And one of them is an empiric phenomenon of Yugoslavism, which has rarely been taken as such as still existing, because mostly when it's referred to, it says, well, nobody actually declares Yugoslav anymore in the census, so it is not of any relevance today. But through the discussions with the interviewees, we could have seen that actually the census are not for them necessarily relevant on how they perceive their own Yugoslav identity. And Yugoslavism is really linked primarily to the generational positionality of the last pioneers. It goes across the political spectrum. And that was also an interesting thing to see, that anti-communism would not necessarily mean anti-Yugoslavism. A number of right-wing interviewees in Slovenia and in Serbia would actually have some Yugoslav outlook, with, of course, always distancing from the socialist Yugoslav country. It is a spatial, it is a cultural, and it is on an anti-nationalist identity and a meta-national identity. What does that mean? Meta-national in the sense that it actually transcends the idea of a national identity in terms of nation states. Yugoslavism of the last pioneers does not demand a recreation of Yugoslavia. It exists outside of this political framework, and it also just complements the multi-layeredness of our identities. So one can actually be a European, a Croat, and a Yugoslav all in the same time. It doesn't necessarily erase one another. Anti-nationalist in the sense that for a lot of last pioneers, Yugoslavism is in a way a resistance strategy. Like one of them would say, well, actually, I never declare as Yugoslav, but only when nationalists gets on my nerve, then I do say so. And for a large number of the interviewees, anti-nationalism was this initial spark which actually brought him to political activism. So when we try to say, okay, so then there is this Yugoslavism, it is part of Yugonostalgia of the last pioneers in a way they understand it, but it is not, it's intersecting, it's not really the same. So then what is Yugonostalgia? And three main ideas actually emerged. Like I have been previously saying, the term itself appears as a discursive strategy of the nationalist post-Yugoslav political elites, trying to erase the memory and entering the memory battles and the memory struggles of the nation-building processes of the post-Yugoslav space. Secondly, it does resonate as an intimate container to reconciliate all these cognitive dissonances, which I have been mentioning between the individual memory narratives and the mainstream discourses on the Yugoslav past. So sometimes we would see, for example, a Hadeze, a member of parliament, saying, well, you know, actually, yeah, I've been to all of Balashevic's concerts, but please just don't sell this to anyone. And so this cultural space, like referring to Yugoslavism, of course, in a way is kind of intimate strategy, how to understand that on one side, they would have good memories on their childhoods, they would have memories which are different and which are counter narratives to the revisionist memory politics of the post-Yugoslav space. And then only thirdly, to a number of interviewees, this Yugonostalgia starts really transforming into a resistance strategy, which goes more, so to say, into political space as a political statement, as a political activity, and just entering more of this social world. And this is the moment where actually to the Yugoslavism, we do add the anti-capitalist strategy. And this refers, of course, largely to the left-wing interviewees, the left-wing last pioneers. This is where this memory on Yugoslavia actually starts to be productive and inducing further reflections of the political space today and for the future political strategies. And of course, how? A number of those strategies that we look into, but depending upon our own understanding of politics as such, they could be said that they are more kind of still individual or personal. For example, what was really interesting to listen to in these narratives, especially remembering their adolescent times, the beginnings of their creation as activists, as anti-nationalist activists. A number of interviewees were saying that today they see that they were continuously falling in love and with the so-called enemies, and that, yeah, of course, part of it was love, but they also think today that it might have been a sort of a political statement for themselves personally as well, a way to resist the imposed national identities, to resist the imposed borders that have been created in the wake of the post-Yugoslav space. And there are then resistance strategy which start to be more articulated, of course, within the framework, which unfortunately we cannot further develop here, but I would imagine that a large number of you are actually aware of growing development of, so to say, new left-wing movements within the post-Yugoslav space. And we can see more and more cooperation between various political groups and organizations and parties in Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia, which are not aligned on the basis of ethno-national communities, but on the ideological orientation. And this is not only true for the left-wing groups. There was this example, and one of the interviewees was actually discussing this situation when I think it was in 2016, the right-wing populist movement Dveri, political party today, has invited in a visit to the Serbian parliament the representative of Živi Zid, a populist movement in Croatia, and this openly identifying as conservative right-wing political actor in Serbia was saying how appalled he was to see his colleagues in the parliament who belonged to some older generations calling them Ustasha, and that this situation was completely incomprehensible to them. So there is a movement here based on generational positionality, which kind of is really bringing forward rather political positionalities as points of meeting, as points of solidarity, as points of cooperation. Then, of course, we can sometimes see different approach to commemoration events, public discourses, trying to define, trying to actually really present publicly the counter narratives to the revisionist memory politics, or even small movements in the commemoration events on the wars of the 1990s. For example, the member of parliament in Croatia, which does belong he wasn't necessarily interviewed, but he belongs to the generation of the last pioneers, Boris Milošević from the Serbian party, who participated in the commemoration events of Oluja this summer. So there are also some certain elements of seeing different approaches to specific memory politics in the public field. And then, of course, the last but absolutely not the least is this question of reflection upon the political regime, public policies of the socialist Yugoslav times. As we could have seen that with a certain generational change, the interest for Yugoslavia has been really rising in the last decade or so within the research and the academic community in the post-Yugoslav space. In the words of the left-wing activists themselves and political actors, they would also in their narratives explain how, yeah, in the beginning when they were starting to kind of for themselves as left-wing subjects, they were always looking towards more the Western-oriented ideas, and they were still completely neglecting the Yugoslav heritage. But they feel that this has been changing and that they are more and more turning towards also the heritage of the left-wing political thought of the socialist Yugoslavia. And I really wanted to leave as much as time possible for the questions. So I'm going to stop here and I'm looking forward to hear your thoughts.
Great. Thank you very much, Milica, for your presentation and your research. And so I would now open the floor for questions, comments. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand or put it in the chat, and then we can discuss your presentation. So who would like to go first? Maybe while everybody is warming up and coming up with good questions, I would be interested in hearing a little bit about like the regional variations of your study, like within the well, you've done interviews in a number of cases. So how does that regional variation play out, and how do you interpret that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really important question that I didn't have more time. Well, first of all, what was really important for me is also to kind of create a methodological approach which would avoid this kind of methodological nationalism. So I was really kind of trying to look at the responses in a more general way. And it was interesting that in a way the research has confirmed that the majority of issues are actually pretty much shared. But then they would appear, of course, sometimes, like I was, for example, saying that this concept of 1990s in one's personal narrative does not exist in Slovenia, and it is extremely salient in Croatia, in Serbia. Another important difference, for example, was really this kind of differentiation between Yugoslavism, Yugonostalgia, the understanding. Because, for example, anti-communism and anti-Yugoslavism in Slovenia and in Serbia do not necessarily go together. While in Croatia, of course, they are more closely interconnected and usually still perceived as one issue. For the right-wing interviewees in Croatia, this is the same question still. There is no different kind of reflection on this point. What was also really interesting to see is that how much that regional identities have often prevailed. And in a lot of narratives, the regional identity was put forward, even the country in which they were living, the citizenship, or their own ethno-national identification. So Primorska or Istria and Dalmatia would have a much stronger effect on one's declaration of identity than necessarily the country. And then once again, also what is always really important to say is that those are the people who live in those countries today. But about 2/3 of the interviewees do come from, so to say, mixed marriages, have refugee experiences, or some even have the post-Yugoslav migrant experiences. So even if they are an interviewee, so to say, from Slovenia, they could actually be from Bosnia and Herzegovina with Serbian and Croatian mixed family heritage, which also I think makes it more difficult to kind of make these neat differentiations. Oh, so this is what happens for the Slovenes, so to say. And I think this is also something very, very important when we approach and try to do this kind of qualitative research. But I still, of course, have to make this kind of point that we also need to keep in mind that my sampling was snowball purposive. So we could also be facing the fact that people with such mixed Yugoslav family origins could have been more prone to participate in the research as such. And this has influenced the results.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Questions from anybody else? I'm looking forward to some questions. I have a lot more, but I also want to give others a chance to chime in with their thoughts and questions. Well, let me just ask you one more question while everybody else is still thinking very hard, is about the kind of political side, of course, and you mentioned this also in your presentation. It's what I think, what is striking is that while there is a lot of this, different kinds, as you mentioned, reflection on the past and the Yugoslav past, it does not have, not political representation in the sense of recreating Yugoslavia, but again, I think what is interesting is how little it reflects. Except for potentially not being on the on the right nationalist right, but other than that, not having a clear political voice or directionality of all of that. Is this something also what people, when in the interviews, how do people think about that, or how much is this? How much did they did they actually look for a political voice, or is this accepted the fact that they have particular maybe views of the Yugoslav past, but that's detached from politics? How is that relationship? How do you see that relationship?
I think that there are a couple of elements that are here important. So the fieldwork was done 2017, 2019. For example, one concept that was really appearing throughout the three countries and the political spectrum was the sense of helplessness. All of the interviewees, even if they are political actors, even if they would be members of parliament, would still discuss the present as something they have no influence on. And I think this is a reflection of the generational positionality, which is, and ever since I actually started writing my thesis, so at the very end of fieldwork, it is starting to change. Some of my interviewees have really becoming more and more prominent within their political parties, etc. So it will be interesting to see how is this going to actually change. I think what is also really for me was kind of like a nice reflection to see. Yes, the sentiment of Yugoslav identity is more related to the generational identity and positionality, but political positionality is more kind of coloring the memory narratives and making the re-narration of the memory narratives and changing the memories than it was the other way around. Really, the political positionality was still more strongly connected to the early childhood political socialization within the family itself. And really, the socialization within the family has proven to be the strongest. The school socialization did not necessarily prove to be essential. But in the same time, this generational positionality puts these actors into this very dissonant, so to say, moments where, as this member of parliament in Slovenia is like, yeah, but of course, I always hang out with the other Yugoslavs. I'm not going to hang out with some Austrians or, that is stupid. And I had one extreme right-wing political actor in Croatia, which was one of the most interesting interviews ever, because if you would hear him speaking publicly, he would say basically, exterminate the Serbian population, and he's really very loud and very outspoken. And he was super interested to participate in an interview. And then he was continuously saying, but I have a lot of friends and I have this personal life, which is still very connected. And that's so he would just kind of start ignoring his personal, his intimate, his memory narrative the moment he would start entering really the public discourse. But I also think that we have to take in mind 2 points. One was all of the interviewees were super happy to talk in a way that like, oh my God, this is the first time somebody has actually asked me to tell the story. I mean, these are people who are political figures, and I would say, well, this is really just for my own research. If you want, we can sign a piece of paper. Nobody asked me to sign a piece of paper. They let me record the interviews without any kind of signed paper. So there was this huge amount of trust, which also I think reveals a certain eagerness to talk. And all of them were extremely reflective. And then at the end, they would say, oh yeah, oh my God, now you make me think about this. And I only now see it this way. So it was a really knowledge co-creation process through the interviews themselves in a way.
Fascinating, thanks. Anna has a question. So Anna, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, oops, okay. Thanks. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of the seminar, so I will abuse my position of and ask how did you choose your interviewees? What was, I mean, in a sense, what was the selection process in the beginning? And then I have a tiny another methodological questions. But I can come to that later. Okay. You can.
Okay. We can do that. Yeah. I'm sorry now. Maybe repeating. I was really looking at a specific generation, the generation of the last pioneers. So that was an uncontrolled variable. So being born between 1974 and 1982. That they were politically active and living in Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. And then the rest of the approach was really snowball purposive sampling. I was trying to have the whole of the political spectrum. I wanted to have, and in the end, it was about a third of people who were members of parliament. Of course, for the members of parliament, it was more straightforward in terms that I would just contact the parliamentary groups of all of the political parties and say, okay, this is what I'm doing. Do you have someone for me? But then, of course, sometimes also it would be difficult, like having a written email response from HDZ, for example, has proven to be a bit challenging. But then in the end, I did manage to obtain 2 interviewees from HDZ, 1 member of parliament, and this right-wing through
other professional politicians. Would you define them like that?
I would just say they have institutionalized role. Okay. Because 1/3 were people who were also members of political parties, but not members of parliament. They could have been members of political parties that function at the national level or the local level, as we see more and more, and then the activists of various social movements.
Okay, the activists, but because it was really strange to get this 2/3 of like a mixed marriage origin in a sample. It's really striking. Can I just now ask this last question? When you conducted your interviews, did you say that your topic of research was Yugonostalgia? Did you kind of like express it loudly?
Yeah, of course. This was not, so this is what I was saying. Yes, of course, this is why we need to have in mind that this was snowball purposive sampling, and that the element in the sample was the fact that people wanted to participate in the research. And then, of course, everything that was coming out of the sample is reflecting also and telling us something different. So at the beginning, I did say I'm not claiming any kind of generalization at all. I'm really just doing a qualitative, interpretative research to see what has been coming out.
Right, because it has like a really specific definition straight from the beginning, the Yugonostalgia. So when you ask someone to talk, if it's like childhood memories, then it's a bit different. When you ask somebody to talk about Yugonostalgia, then I would say that it really kind of narrows the direction of thinking.
No, we were doing the life narratives. I was actually doing the whole story with them. So it wasn't like, yeah, let's talk about Yugonostalgia. That wasn't the only question. My interviews lasted from 1.5 hours to 4 or 5 hours, some of them. And I was actually going through the narrative. So I would say I'm doing a research on the memories on Yugoslavia, on the socialist Yugoslavia, Yugonostalgia, and your own life growing up. So we would start really from them telling me who they are, their life story, how they grew up, how do they remember Yugoslavia, how do they remember the war, how do they understand it today. So it wasn't just focused on Yugonostalgia as a question.
No, I got that.
Okay, I think Anna, you broke up. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's. Oh, okay. Now you're back, but we can hear you again. Maybe if you want to add something, but then we have Marlena who has a question as well.
Yeah, I don't want to abuse the space. I just want to say that it's a really kind of a trigger term, the Yugonostalgia, and that's why I wanted to know how you methodologically integrated it in your research. But thanks.
Okay, thanks, Marlena. The floor is yours for your question.
Hi, yeah, first of all, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I have two small questions. First one would be, what would you expect when, for example, interviewing Bosniaks as well? Would you expect similar results? Would you expect some things to be a bit more expressed than others? And also, I don't remember if I understood it correctly. Was it like an anonymous interview? Because I think I heard also some names. Because
it was anonymous. It was completely anonymous. There are no names. I was just giving examples of personal actors we know that belong to the generation, but they were not my interviewees. So yeah, like I was saying, this was also an interesting point of view, this trust that has been shown, that they weren't requiring additional security protocols, but just my word that I'm recording and it's anonymous was enough. Which is interesting for itself to kind of see. Whether I would have the same results in other, I wouldn't really dare to say so. I read that is, I mean, this and also what Anna was saying, a trigger and etc. Yeah, of course, but that was the reason why I was really taking this grounded theory approach. I was really trying to go listen to the stories and then see what the stories, what the narratives tell me, as much as possible on one side, avoiding imposing certain hypotheses, and in the second time, of course, having this continuous reflexive process with myself and my own positionality, because of course that this kind of trust, for example, that I was given by the interviewees might not have been the same if I was a researcher coming from a non-post-Yugoslav country, if I did not belong to the same generation where we could actually share this kind of experience. So this is really a large part. I mean, unfortunately, I couldn't have talked so much about all the methodological challenges of the research as such, but these were really important elements. I wouldn't really try to claim if the results would be same. What is interesting is that a large number of results and the tropes would appear really across all of the three countries and all of the political spectrum. And when you see all of a sudden certain codes emerging in the most unexpected, even so to say, places, then for me it really meant that this is a concept that I should look into and see what does it unpack, what does it uncover.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Do we have any other question from anybody? I mean, I would pick up on maybe something which you mentioned, that how people, respondees in Serbia and in Slovenia, could kind of detach Yugoslavia from socialism, or kind of that this was not automatic. And I just kind of was curious about that, what that meant. Is it just meaning that the understanding of Yugoslavia is then just apolitical? Or is it like imagining is it like imagining Yugoslavia without socialism? Because again, I mean, the memory is very much shaped by socialism, and it's, you know, nobody is remembering or fondly remembering, as far as I know, interwar Yugoslavia. So in that sense, of course, it's a socialist Yugoslavia. So I'm just kind of wondering, what does that mean, this possibility to divide socialism and Yugoslavia?
I think it's really in terms of this point where they kind of dialogue their own narratives and political positionality what the mainstream public discourse is. In terms that, no, it remains political. I mean, one right-wing interviewee in Slovenia said, yeah, of course, we can imagine a new Yugoslavia. The only problem is that there are Croats in between. And it is for them, for example, and I think what was more interesting in Slovenia and in Serbia, this was more connected also that among the right-wing interviewees, positive reflections on the socialist times were connected to this idea of greatness of a country, sovereignty, respecting the international world, which they mourn today in their own post-Yugoslav states, regardless of nation building. While, of course, in Croatia, this is really much more interflected, and it doesn't get that separated. But it is an interesting point to look further into why is this happening. And also, I mean, this was done before Janez Janša coming back to government and also kind of showing a different picture. But even within, for example, SDS in Slovenia, from two interviewees, you would get very different positions. So it's not unified, like the revisionist narrative is not unified, it's not stable. We see it changing all the time. We see having anti-Yugoslav, socialist Yugoslav narratives, but in the same time wishing to be like Tito, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, a lot of political actors are showing this. So the individual kind of memory narratives and this meaning-making process also tend to be very ambivalent. In a way.
Well, I guess it's also, I mean, I think, as you rightly say, it's changing over time. And maybe this is also a response to Anna's question about the triggering of Yugonostalgia, or talking that it might be less sensitive, at least in some contexts today, than it was, 10 or 15 years ago. And it's changing, and that it might become more acceptable. I mean, not to declare yourself to be Yugonostalgic in public, but to have some positive memories. And of course, I mean, we know this also from, you've mentioned nostalgia, and a lot of the other nostalgias for communism often are very much connected with a link for authority and a strong state. And that can be, and in fact, you find it often in the far right, that like, in East Germany, a lot of the kind of AfD and supporters often have a positive image of the GDR. And I'm not want to compare it with Yugoslavia, but it's this idea of a predictable, stable state which is able to exercise its authority, is something which, of course, is also far right-wing imagination in many ways. So, you can see how these themes are accessible for not just the political left, but people from the political right as well.
I would say that the right wing definitely had much more ambiguous relationship towards the socialist Yugoslav past, because of course there is an element of anti-capitalism, anti-neoliberal capitalism that kind of brings the nationalists to the table and then kind of interplays. The most adamantly, directly negative positioning were actually seen from the center liberal political interviewees. I mean, the only one who said anti-fascism is a total stupidity comes from a weird, so to say, sometimes it's also difficult to kind of say where do they position themselves. He says libertarian, I would say right-wing, center, whatever political party in Serbia. He was the only one talking about the Russian occupation instead of a liberation. So, I mean, yeah, of course, this and it definitely changes over time. I mean, I've started working on the topic of Yugonostalgia in 2010 already for my master's studies. And I mean, even just the literature that existed back then and that exists today is incomparable. I mean, so much has been produced. But also the interviewees themselves had this reflection that, yeah, we would have had a different conversation 10 years ago. And I, from the point of view of memory as an object of research, I think memory is always changing. So when we actually work with memory narratives, that's why I always say these are the memory narratives that were given at the time of the research. Even today, they might have been different.
Thanks. I think we have two questions in the chat. One is your research already published? So somebody can't wait to see your PhD. And the other one is, why didn't you include other countries like North Macedonia, Montenegro, Bosnia in your research, and I guess Kosovo, would be also.
Yes, I would have loved to had the ability to do the whole, but then, as we all know, and especially without any funding, being a PhD research, you just have to choose. In the end, I've chosen Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia for a number of reasons. I thought that they were really interesting examples. There is a symbolic element of this first Yugoslavian kingdom of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. There are very different transitional trajectories, with Slovenia being the good EU pupil, so to say, Croatia barely entering the European Union, but not really working out that well, and then Serbia where it is. So I just had to be very practical, unfortunately. And then, of course, I mean, this took 2 years in the field work, so I can only imagine how much longer I would have spent in the field work if all of the countries were actually included. How long? Yeah, I was in the field from 2017 to 2019. How long it took me to write the PhD thesis is a sensitive question. Let's not go into that.
But has it been published? I mean, not the PhD, of course, but have you published some of your research? I guess this is what Rebecca's asking.
I have a lot of articles, not directly always. Some of the concepts have been reflected in some of the articles that have been published. But the thesis as such, not yet in the form of an article or I hope a book in a couple of years. So yeah, that's
always desirable for everybody. So if you want to, I can also share your email address in the chat, and then anybody can contact you if they want to actually find some of the articles which you've written. So I can just do that, and then everybody who's interested can contact you with further readings and further suggestions. So I think this is a good point to stop, because then people will read on. And thank you, Milica, for sharing your research with us, and good luck in finishing up the last part of your PhD. And then we'll all look forward to reading it as a book, and maybe with more countries included. We'll see. Yeah. Anyhow, thanks to everybody. Thanks for your questions. And Milica, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you so much for the invitation.